Laura Bennett arrived at Cedar Creek Medical before the sun cleared the Front Range, moving through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, invisible the way she'd perfected over 3 years. The fluorescent lights flickered in a rhythm that used to set her teeth on edge. Not anymore. Pain was information. Fluorescent hum was just background noise. She'd learned to filter out everything except what mattered. The pediatric wing was still quiet. That wouldn't last. She pulled open her locker, metal door that creaked like a Black Hawk door hinge, and her hand found the object she touched every morning. The flag. Folded into a perfect triangle, tight as a fist, triangle tight the way Martinez's wife had folded it in Arlington. 14 months ago. Some days felt like yesterday. Some days felt like a different lifetime entirely. She closed the locker without making a sound. Scrubs came next. Blue ones today. The color didn't matter. What mattered was that scrubs were a uniform that made her invisible, a costume that let her disappear into the machinery of a hospital the way she'd learned to disappear into the architecture of Fallujah, into the dust of Sanjin Valley, into the machinery of survival itself. She pulled the scrubs over the scars running down her left shoulder, parallel lines from shrapnel, from the classified operation the Pentagon had erased, from the moment that changed the trajectory of everything. Captain Laura Bennett didn't exist anymore. Not officially. Not according to any record that could be found. She was just a nurse now. Just another woman in blue scrubs, moving through a pediatric ward like she'd never held a tourniquet on a femoral artery while rounds exploded around her head. Like she'd never triaged 14 casualties in 7 minutes. Like she'd never heard the sound a child makes when bleeding out. The crash cart needed checking. Laura moved to the supply station, running through the contents with the same precision she'd once used to inventory trauma kits in a field hospital outside Baghdad. Epinephrine. Check. Atropine. Check. Pediatric defibrillation pads. Check. For catheters in ascending sizes, 24 gauge, 22 gauge, 20 gauge. Her hands moved through the sequence without hesitation, muscle memory from a life she no longer claimed. The equipment lived in her hands the way it lived in her muscle fibers. A door opened down the corridor. Footsteps. Not rushed. Authoritative. She didn't look up. Colonel Marcus Webb came through the pediatric wing entrance at 6:48 a.m., carrying his son like the weight was both everything and nothing at all. Connor Webb was 8 years old, small for his age, his hands already moving in sign language before his father set him down. The boy's shoulders tensed and released, tensed and released. Anticipatory. Afraid. Laura recognized that posture the way she recognized the tremor in her own hands when sirens passed. The colonel was Delta Force. She knew this the way she knew everything without being told. It was in the way he moved, efficient, controlled, the kind of calm that only came from having survived the worst and emerged still standing. His jaw was set tight. Frustrated. The frustration of a man accustomed to solving problems with direct action, now facing something that direct action couldn't fix. Connor's eyes were bright. Intelligent. His hand shaped words in ASL that his father interpreted for the intake nurse, who nodded and typed information into a computer, not really listening to what any of it meant. 8 years old. Mysterious seizures. Episodes happening without warning. Duration, 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Frequency, increasing over the past 6 weeks. The intake nurse wrote it down like she was transcribing a restaurant reservation. Laura was organizing supply carts near the nurse's station when she caught sight of them in exam room 4. She didn't look directly. Looking directly wasn't invisible. Instead, she arranged sterile gauze packages in rows of 5, a rhythm she could perform without conscious thought, her peripheral vision tracking the child in the exam room the way it had once tracked the horizon outside an Osprey transport, watching for threats. Connor's posture shifted. Subtle. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his chin dropped a fraction lower, the slight pallor spreading across his cheeks. Cyanosis beginning at the lips. Laura's breathing didn't change. Her hands didn't pause. But something in her registered it the way seismic equipment registers the first tremor before an earthquake. That wasn't behavioral. That wasn't psychological frustration from communication problems. That was neurological. That was something else entirely. The colonel saw it too. She watched his hand move to his son's shoulder, watched him call for the nurse, watched the intake nurse stick her head back into the exam room with the distracted expression of someone interrupted during paperwork. The episode passed. Connor's color returned. Normal breathing resumed. Whatever it was, it lasted maybe 40 seconds. Dr. Pierce arrived during morning rounds like a force of nature with a Rolex and a superiority complex that moved ahead of him like a pressure wave. He worked through the pediatric ward with the efficiency of someone running through a checklist, not really looking at individual children, assessing cases with the kind of cursory attention that made them all blur into diagnostic categories. Failure to thrive. Asthma exacerbation. Behavioral issues stemming from inadequate home environment. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a symbol of authority rather than a tool for listening. Laura pushed a fresh supply cart past the group of medical residents trailing him like pilot fish following a shark. She could feel Pierce's eyes pass over her the way searchlights pass over empty ocean. Invisible. Exactly as intended. But she slowed her pace as the group approached exam room 4, where Connor Webb sat waiting, where the colonel stood with his arms crossed, watching his son with the intensity of someone trying to decode a locked door. Pierce scanned the chart. 2 minutes of review. Seizures of unclear etiology. Increased frequency. History of deafness since birth. His face shifted into an expression Laura recognized from 3 years of observation. Dismissal. The particular dismissal reserved for cases that didn't fit neat diagnostic boxes. Behavioral, Pierce said, his voice carrying through the hallway the way voices of certain men always carried. 8-year-old deaf child. Limited communication. Frustration manifesting as seizure-like episodes. Completely psychological. We're looking at anxiety, not neurology. The colonel's jaw tightened. My son's episodes are not anxiety attacks, doctor. They're seizures. I've served long enough to know the difference between fear and a medical emergency. With respect, Colonel, children's seizure presentations are highly variable, and in cases of severe communication deficits, behavioral mimicry can look very similar. I'd recommend psychiatric evaluation, not additional neurology workup. We don't want to over-medicalize normal childhood anxiety. The colonel didn't respond. But his hand moved to Connor's shoulder in a way that suggested he disagreed with every word. Pierce moved on, trailing his residents like they were tethered to him. The rounds continued. Laura organized her supply cart with meticulous precision, each item placed at a specific angle, a rhythm that let her mind process information the way it had processed threat assessments in forward operating bases. The child's posture. The tremor before the episodes. The cyanosis. The colonel's certainty that something was medically wrong. The way Pierce had listened for maybe 90 seconds and decided the case was closed. She'd seen this movie before. Not in a pediatric ward, but in a trauma tent outside Fallujah where a combat medic insisted he knew his own body better than the attending physician. Turned out the medic was right. The attending was wrong. By the time anyone listened, the patient had lost 3 units of blood. That wasn't happening to Connor Webb. Not if she could help it. Not if she understood what she was looking at. The morning light came through the pediatric wing windows, turning the antiseptic-scented corridors into something almost peaceful. Almost. Laura returned the supply cart to its station and pulled on latex gloves, the snap of them quick and precise, and waited for her assignment. Somewhere in this hospital, a child who couldn't hear and couldn't speak was trying to tell the world that something was wrong. And somewhere in an exam room, his father was trying to listen. The day was only beginning. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of routine. 12 residents, 3 attending physicians, 4 medical students crammed into the pediatrics conference room at Cedar Creek Medical. The projector hummed its fluorescent drone as Dr. Pierce pulled up Connor Webb's chart, and Laura felt the shift in air pressure the moment his name appeared on screen. She sat in the back row, her badge clipped to scrubs that still smelled faintly of the antibacterial soap from her 6 a.m. rounds, and watched him move to the front like a conductor approaching a podium. "Let's discuss appropriate professional boundaries," Pierce began, his voice carrying that particular texture of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. He didn't look at Laura. He gestures toward her seat without turning, the movement calculated. "Our nurse Bennett here has been leaving rather extensive notes in patient files. She's concerned that 8-year-old Connor Webb's seizure activity indicates an underlying structural defect. Possibly some form of occult hydrocephalus or a thalamic lesion." He turned to the residents then, spreading his hands like a magician revealing an empty cage. 3 years of nursing school versus 23 years of pediatric medicine. Can anyone guess who might understand developmental neurology better? Nervous laughter rippled through the room like wind through a wheat field. Laura recognized the tactic. She'd seen it before in another life, in different uniforms, the way commanders isolated targets by making them the object of collective ridicule. Make them small. Make them alone. Make them question if their observations even mattered. Pierce continued, his tone dropping to something almost paternal. "What we're actually seeing here is behavioral manifestation stemming from communication frustration. Deaf children frequently present with pseudo-seizure activity, particularly when they haven't developed adequate sign language proficiency. Colonel Webb's son is anxious. His anxiety manifests as motor activity that mimics seizures. It's textbook." The words hit Laura like shrapnel, sharp and embedded. She'd spent for hours reviewing Connor's monitoring data at 2 a.m. because she couldn't sleep, because the pattern she'd observed didn't fit Pierce's narrative. Seizure activity synchronized with sleep cycles. Oxygen desaturation preceding the motor events by an average of 4 to 7 seconds. In Baghdad, she'd learned to read the body's honest language when words failed. Pain was data. Movement was communication. Physiology didn't lie, but doctors frequently did. Laura took one measured breath. Then another. Her hands remained folded in her lap, steady as surgical steel. She didn't tremble. She didn't look away. She simply sat with the weight of what she knew and what she couldn't yet say, her spine pressed against the cold plastic chair, and waited for the moment to pass. Pierce closed the chart. The presentation was over. 2 hours later, the break room. Laura was reaching for the last coffee cup, dark roast, 3 years old at Cedar Creek, strong enough to strip paint, when Pierce's voice cut through the alcove space like a scalpel through tissue. "Still here, Nightingale." He'd stopped 3 feet away, flanked by 2 residents who immediately checked their phones, suddenly fascinated by their screens. "I thought maybe you'd realized by now that you should stick to bedpans and blood pressure cuffs instead of playing doctor with cases beyond your scope. Maybe you got your credentials from one of those online programs." The residents laughed. One of them, Thompson, nervous disposition, still learning how to stand in his own authority, actually looked pained by the sound coming out of his own mouth. Laura set down her coffee cup with the precision of someone disarming an explosive device. 1. Measured. Movement. She watched the dark liquid settle, the steam rising in careful spirals, and then she lifted her eyes to meet Pierce's. One single tear escaped. She didn't know where it came from. Not pain. Not fear. Something else entirely. Something that had been held behind a military-grade dam for 3 years and 247 days. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without dropping her gaze, and when she spoke, her voice emerged like still water, perfectly calm, perfectly clear, perfectly lethal. "I've triaged more critical patients before breakfast in Baghdad than you'll see in your career." The words hung in the break room air. "But you wouldn't know anything about that." The room went dead silent. Pierce's face transformed. The patronizing smile vanished. His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. A vein at his temple pulsed once, twice, 3 times. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, dropped an octave, lost its professorial veneer, become something harder and genuinely threatened. That's insubordination. Each word landed separately, deliberately, like rounds from a weapon. One more outburst like that and I will have security escort you out of this hospital permanently. Do we understand each other? Laura nodded once. A simple acknowledgement. No apology. No explanation. No breaking. She picked up her coffee cup, and her hands were shaking so badly that the liquid sloshed over the rim and spilled across the floor, dark brown spreading across white tile like blood bloom. She walked away before he could see anything else. But that wasn't the worst part. Pierce had already made the calls. By Friday, Laura discovered that her badge wouldn't open the medication room on the 3rd floor. The nursing director's office called her into a meeting, brief, clinical, documented, where a human resources representative explained that she'd been reassigned to overnight rotations effective immediately. For better workflow optimization, the HR woman said, not meeting her eyes. Nurse Practica, the one veteran on staff who'd mentioned Afghanistan, who Laura had tentatively thought might understand the weight of what she carried, was reassigned to orthopedics on the 6th floor. Laura found out from a text message while restocking the pediatric supply cart. During an administrative meeting Laura wasn't invited to, Pierce presented a concerning behavioral pattern. Her chart notes challenging his diagnoses. Her aggressive confrontation in the break room, he'd apparently mentioned it to every resident who'd heard about it, amplifying the story until it had become something darker than what actually happened. He included a formal complaint about scope creep, citing her insistence on conducting independent neurological assessments without physician authorization. By Monday morning, her computer access had changed. Her login now required supervisor approval before she could document patient care. Her badge wouldn't grant her access to the medication room. Her name disappeared from Connor Webb's care team roster, replaced by Marcus Chen, a newer nurse who'd learned early never to question anything Pierce said. Laura discovered these changes incrementally, the way a person discovers a building is on fire, first smoke, then the smell, then the heat, and finally the understanding that everything is already burning. She tried to document what she'd observed. On Tuesday night during her first overnight shift, she pulled Connor's monitored data from the past 72 hours. The seizure frequency was increasing, now occurring twice daily instead of once. The oxygen desaturation was consistent, always preceding the motor events by an average of 5 to 6 seconds. The pattern screamed tension pneumothorax, a congenital defect in the pleural space that would explain everything Pierce had dismissed. But when she tried to add her observations to the chart, the system flagged her entry, documentation flagged as outside assigned duties. Requires supervisor authorization. Supervisor override declined. She was locked out of her own patient's care. Colonel Webb arrived Thursday during the afternoon shift, the shift Laura no longer worked, visibly frustrated. She caught him in the hallway outside Connor's room as he was leaving, his jaw tight, his shoulders carrying the particular weight of a man accustomed to solving problems through force and now facing something that required paperwork and bureaucracy instead. "Colonel Webb," she said quietly. "I'm glad to see Connor's doing poorly." He cut her off, not unkindly, but with the directness of someone who'd spent his career in environments where inefficiency got people killed. "Seizures are worse. His doctor says it's anxiety. Says I need to get him into sign language classes faster, like he's somehow failing at being deaf." Webb's eyes narrowed. "You're the nurse who was on his care team before. The one who actually seemed to notice things." Laura chose her next words with the precision of someone diffusing explosives. "The seizure pattern warrants investigation." "That's what I thought." He paused, studying her face. "Why aren't you on his care team anymore?" She couldn't answer without revealing the trap. Couldn't explain without admitting she'd been targeted. Couldn't fight back without disclosing classified military service that officially never happened, clearances that required her silence, missions buried so deep that speaking them aloud would violate federal law. "Hospital staffing," she said finally, the words tasting like ashes. "Rotation changes." Pierce made the personal call that same afternoon. To Dr. Gerald Ashford, president of the Cedar Creek Medical Board and his regular golf partner. Laura overheard it accidentally while passing the administrative offices. Pierce's door had been left open, his voice carrying that smooth, concerned tone he reserved for authority figures. "I hate to bring this up, but we may have a liability issue with an overzealous nurse who's making families uncomfortable. She's been pushing for unnecessary diagnostics on Colonel Webb's son, suggesting I've missed something. You know how families are, one suggestion and they're requesting second opinions, demanding imaging studies that insurance won't cover. If something happened and it came out that our nursing staff had been encouraging the parents to doubt the physician's assessment." He let that sentence trail off, the implication spreading like smoke. "I'm not saying she's incompetent. I'm saying we need to protect the hospital." "I'm going on break," Laura thought grimly as she walked past the office without stopping. "I definitely need some Jell-O." By Friday, Connor Webb's chart showed seizures increasing to twice daily. Pierce's notes were consistent: behavioral manifestations, no intervention required. Recommend psychology consult an accelerated sign language program. Laura watched from the nursing station during her overnight shift, monitoring his vitals remotely from a hospital room 3 floors away. She saw his oxygen saturation drop from 94 to 87%. Saw it happen for minutes before the motor event started. Saw the pattern that Pierce refused to acknowledge, that should have triggered imaging, that would have revealed the structural defect that was slowly robbing this 8-year-old boy of oxygen with each passing night. She sat at a computer she wasn't supposed to access, reading a chart she wasn't authorized to review, watching a patient she'd been removed from, her hand steady because training had taught her that trembling didn't save lives, only action did. And somewhere in an exam room 3 floors down, Connor Webb was sleeping fitfully, his small body preparing for the next seizure, his father sitting beside him wondering if he was failing his son by trusting the wrong doctor. The next morning, Laura found her reassignment notice in her locker, permanently transferred to overnight pediatrics, effective immediately, with a note about optimized staffing patterns. She held the paper in both hands and let herself feel nothing at all. The reassignment notice sat on Laura's kitchen table at 0347 hours, crisp and official, already 3 days old. She'd memorized it: overnight rotations, pediatric isolation ward, effective immediately, no exceptions listed, but the message was clear enough, buried alive with the paperwork to prove it. What she didn't know was that Dr. Pierce had already made 6 phone calls. The first came at 0612 on a Tuesday, before coffee, before the hospital corridor lights flickered to full brightness. Pierce dialed the nursing director with the precision of a man who understood institutional architecture the way a sniper understands wind patterns. His voice carried the careful concern of someone invested in patient safety, in systemic efficiency, in the well-being of the department he controlled like a kingdom carved from white coats and fear. "We need to discuss staffing optimization," he said, and the director listened because Pierce's name carried weight, because his research had been published in journals that mattered, because saying no to him meant defending someone else's competence instead of your own. By 10:45, Laura's shift partner, the only nurse on pediatrics rotation who had heard Laura's careful assessment of Connor Webb's neurological presentation, the only witness who might have said something true about what she'd observed, was transferred to the burn unit. 3 floors up. Different attending. Different schedule. The transfer request came with a commendation in the same memo: excellent opportunity for career development, leadership pipeline, recognition of her skills. She'd be gone by Friday. The isolation was surgical. Precise. Pierce didn't yell or threaten. He simply moved pieces on the board the way a chess master eliminates opposition without announcing his strategy. No paper trail that said anything but operational necessity. No email chains that sounded like anything but administrative competence. The duty roster changed. The staffing patterns shifted. Laura went from the day shift population of 40 medical professionals to the overnight shift skeleton crew of 4. Night shift in pediatrics at Cedar Creek Medical was a landscape of fluorescent hum and minimal supervision. The attending physician who covered overnight was Dr. Morris, fresh out of residency, nervous as a new recruit on his first deployment, the kind of doctor who followed protocols because he was still afraid of breaking them. He didn't know Laura. He'd never seen her work. He'd only heard her name mentioned in passing by Pierce with a slight shake of the head that suggested concern, that implied something unspoken but heavy. When Laura arrived for her first overnight shift, the ward was already quiet in that particular way hospitals get at 2,100 hours, machinery breathing, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, the smell of antiseptic mixing with something underneath it, something human and tired and afraid. She walked past Connor Webb's room without stopping. His door was closed. She could see his father's silhouette through the small window, Colonel Marcus Webb sitting in the chair beside his son's bed, one massive hand resting on the boy's small shoulder while Connor slept, his face peaceful in a way that made Laura's chest tighten with something she'd learned long ago not to call hope. The night shift paperwork was endless. Charts to update. Observations to document. The other nurses, a tired rotating staff of per diem workers who barely knew the permanent layout, didn't speak much to Laura. Nothing hostile. Just nothing. The way people treat someone who's been marked as expendable. But that wasn't the worst part. The protocols Pierce had written for Connor Webb were posted in the chart, crystal clear in his handwriting, recurring episodes consistent with behavioral manifestations secondary to communication frustration. Monitor vital signs Q for H. Seizure activity expected, non-pathological. No intervention without attending physician consultation. Do not escalate. Laura read them twice. 3 times. The kind of reading that isn't about understanding anymore, it's about accepting something you're required to live with. She was working the 2100 to 0700 rotation when it happened. Tuesday night sliding into Wednesday morning. She was in room for 12, changing the fluids on an 8-year-old with acute appendicitis, when the alarm came, not a subtle beep but the full code alert, the crash cart alarm that made every cell in her body recognize danger with the same clarity she'd learned in a medical convoy outside Fallujah. The sound came from Connor's room. Room 307. For doors down. The distance of about 30 seconds if you ran. Laura was already moving when she heard Dr. Morris's voice, panicked, calling for help. The words didn't matter, his tone was the emergency. She heard Colonel Webb shouting his son's name, heard the mechanical violence of a small body seizing, heard the monitors screaming their alarms like wounded animals. She didn't think. Muscle memory didn't ask for permission. Her boots covered the distance in 8 seconds, and what she saw would have frozen anyone else. Connor Webb's small frame convulsing against the white sheets, his body arched backward in the position no child should ever be forced into, his lips already beginning to darken from pink to a terrible dusky blue. The monitors registered the catastrophe in real time, oxygen saturation at 94% as she entered the room, dropping to 88 by the time she reached the bedside, falling like an elevator with a severed cable. Colonel Webb's face was the face of a man whose training meant nothing because no amount of tactical expertise could save his child from physics and biology and the particular cruelty of a body turning against itself. His chest, Laura said to Dr. Morris, who was frozen in the doorway, whose hands hung at his sides like they belonged to someone else. Look at his chest. Connor's right side wasn't rising and falling with breath. It was distended. Rigid. His trachea had deviated left, she could see the outline of his small neck, could register the jugular veins standing out like dark cords beneath his skin. The breath sounds on the right side were absent. Completely. The silence of a lung that wasn't working was louder than the alarms. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis came to her the way answers came in combat, not as a thought but as knowledge, as muscle memory recognizing a pattern her hands already knew how to solve. She moved to the crash cart. Grabbed the needle decompression kit. 14-gauge angiocath, the needle sharp and clean and ready. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The landmarks were the same whether you were in a combat hospital in Baghdad or Colorado Springs. Human anatomy didn't care about geography or regulation. I need you to hold still, she said to Connor, but he couldn't hear her, his deaf son, his child who communicated in a language that didn't require sound. So she caught Colonel Webb's eye. She saw the moment he recognized what she was about to do, saw his understanding arrive like a helicopter descending through smoke. He placed his massive hand on Connor's forehead, pressed his other hand against his son's small chest, and signed with one trembling hand, signs Laura didn't know but understood anyway. Safety. Love. Trust. The language his son could receive. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping from the pneumothorax came like a sigh, like relief taking physical form. The needle itself was barely 3 inches, but it connected to something profound. It connected to the moment between death and survival, to the precision that separates them. The oxygen saturation climbed. 78%. 82. 87. 92. Connor's lips flushed pink again. The seizure activity stopped. His body went still, his breathing gradually synchronizing with the ventilator's rhythm, his small chest rising and falling with air that could reach his lungs again. Dr. Morris stared at her. Not with gratitude. With the particular horror that comes when you realize someone around you saw something you couldn't see, understood something you didn't understand, and acted while you froze. Colonel Webb looked at Laura like she was something from another world entirely, his hand still on his son's head, tears streaming down his face in that way that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the knowledge that his child was alive because a nurse in a pediatric ward had remembered how to save a life. "How did you?" Colonel Webb started, his voice rough as desert sand. Laura was already documenting. Already writing the chart. Already knowing that every word she wrote was evidence against her, that she had just violated Pierce's explicit protocol, that she had just transcended her scope of practice in the most irreversible way possible. The documentation would show what she'd done. The chart would prove it. The evidence of her competence was the evidence of her violation. But that wasn't what mattered in the moment. In the moment, Connor Webb was breathing. In the moment, there was still air in his lungs and oxygen in his blood and a chance at a tomorrow. Dr. Morris found his voice. "I need to call Dr. Pierce immediately." Laura nodded. She already knew what was coming next. Connor Webb's body went rigid at 2:48 a.m. The seizure started as a tremor in his small fingers, then violence took over. His back arched off the observation bed like someone had run current through his spine. His lips darkened from pink to blue to something closer to slate. The heart monitor screamed. The oxygen saturation numbers fell like a stone, 96, 92, 87, 81, dropping past the point where alarms stop being warnings and become indictments. Laura was at the bedside before the attending physician finished processing what was happening. Dr. Morris stood frozen 3 feet away, his hands halfway to his pockets, watching the numbers fall like he'd never seen a child seize before. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe he'd only read about it in textbooks written by people who'd also never held a dying child in their hands. Laura's hands moved on their own. Muscle memory. Muscle memory from triage tents in Baghdad where she'd stabilized 14 casualties in 6 hours while rounds came through the canvas like angry wasps. This 8-year-old deaf boy with his father's jaw and his mother's dark eyes was just the next patient. The diagnosis was already written in his presentation, the way his body bent wrong, the way his oxygen wouldn't climb no matter what the ventilator pushed into his lungs, the telltale silence where breath sounds should have been. Tension pneumothorax. Congenital diaphragmatic defect. The exact condition Pierce had dismissed for months ago as communication frustration manifesting as behavioral episodes. "Page ICU," Laura said. Not a request. A command. She already had the 14-gauge angiocath needle in her hand, swabbed in betadine, positioned at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy was the same in a child as it was in a 22-year-old Marine with a sucking chest wound. The angle was the same. The pressure required was different. She'd adjusted for his small ribs, his narrow chest, the fact that one mistake would collapse his lung instead of saving it. The needle went in. A hiss. The sound of air under tension escaping, that single exhalation of relief that meant the pressure crushing his heart would stop. The monitor numbers climbed. 84, 89. 92, 96. Connor's body went slack. His back flattened against the mattress. His lips faded from slate back toward pink. Dr. Morris made a sound. Something between a gasp and a prayer. Call trauma surgery, Laura said. He needs a chest tube and exploratory thoracotomy. Tell them Dr. Pierce's congenital dismissal was wrong. Kid's got a diaphragmatic defect that's been pressurizing the thoracic cavity for months. That's what caused the seizures. Not psychology. Physics. The attending moved. Finally. He grabbed the phone with the jerky movements of someone waking from a nightmare. Connor's oxygen climbed to 98. His small fingers stopped trembling. His heart rhythm settled into something steady, something that might survive the night. Laura stepped back. Pulled off the gloves. Dropped them in the sharps container with the precise snap of someone filing a report, not someone who'd just done something that would end her career. But that wasn't the worst part. Pierce emerged from the OR at 6:15 a.m. He came straight to the ICU without changing out of his surgical scrubs, without showering off the blood of the patient he'd spent 6 hours reconstructing. Someone had already briefed him. Laura watched his face process the information, watched the moment he understood that his dismissal had been wrong, that the seizures weren't behavioral, that an 8-year-old child had come within minutes of cardiac arrest because he'd chosen not to look deeper. His face went white. Then the white faded and something worse took its place. Not rage. Not yet. Something colder. Something with the precision of a surgeon planning an incision. He didn't approach Laura. He didn't say a word to her. He walked to the nursing station, pulled out his phone, and made 3 calls. The first went to the hospital board president. Laura couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language, the way Pierce's shoulders straightened, the way his voice dropped into the register of a man who was about to destroy someone and wanted them destroyed completely. Massive liability exposure, she caught. Unauthorized procedures. Practicing medicine without a license. The second call went to the chief nursing officer. This one took longer. This one involved him walking toward the break room, probably so Laura couldn't lip read. When he came back, his expression was that calm smile of someone who'd just moved a chess piece 3 moves ahead. The third call was to hospital legal. Then he found Dr. Morris in the ICU hallway. Just found him. Casually. The way a predator finds wounded prey. "You're up for chief resident next year, aren't you?" Pierce said. Soft voice. That selection committee is very careful about leadership capability. About the ability to manage staff. Would be unfortunate if they thought you'd lost control of your nursing personnel. Dr. Morris's face changed color. By 8 a.m., the duty roster had been altered. The records were rewritten. It now appeared that Laura had been assigned to Connor's care all night, which meant her intervention wasn't emergency response but scope violation. It now appeared that she'd abandoned her other patients to treat a case that wasn't hers. Security footage was pulled, timestamps cherry-picked to show her away from her assigned bed in the south wing, not mentioning that she'd left a cardiac monitor on her patient, not mentioning that the south wing patient had been stable and sleeping. The only nurse who'd witnessed everything, Nurse Chen, the one who'd brought the crash cart, the one who could have testified about the emergency, got reassigned to night shift in the ER. Before shift change. Before she could talk to anyone. By 9 a.m., Laura was called to human resources. The office was small and beige and smelled like burnt coffee and the kind of institutional dread that came with having security waiting outside the door. The HR director read from a prepared document like she was delivering a prison sentence, exceeding scope of practice, performing invasive medical procedures without authorization, insubordination, violation of hospital policy, creating liability exposure, practicing medicine without a nursing license. "Your badge is being deactivated effective immediately," the director said. "We'll need your ID, your access keys, and any hospital property in your possession." Laura didn't argue. Couldn't argue. To defend herself, she'd have to explain that she performed the procedure because she recognized a life-threatening condition that a physician had missed. She'd have to say that her training in emergency triage came from somewhere. She'd have to mention captain's rank, Delta Force, Baghdad, Operation Sandstorm, all of it classified, all of it requiring her silence, all of it officially erased by the Pentagon so thoroughly that it would take a security clearance and a general's authorization just to confirm it had happened. She stood up, walked past the security guard stationed outside the door. The guard didn't touch her. He just followed, 3 respectful steps behind, while she collected the items from her locker, a cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a dying succulent she'd kept alive for 2 years in defiance of her capacity for care, a photograph of her Delta Medevac team before the ambush, Martinez on her left with his arm around her shoulders, both of them grinning despite the 120-degree heat and the knowledge that they had 4 more hours of convoy duty in hostile territory. And the flag. The folded flag from Martinez's funeral, triangle-tight, wrapped in plastic, carried in her locker for 6 years because there was nowhere else to put a piece of your brother that you couldn't bury. She packed it all into a cardboard box. 15 minutes. One life reduced to the size of something a janitor would throw away. The rain started at 5:53 p.m. when she stood at the bus stop outside Cedar Creek Medical. Not gentle rain. The kind of rain that hammered the pavement like applause for a terrible performance. She held the cardboard box on her hip, watching through the downpour at the building where she'd saved an 8-year-old boy's life and lost everything doing it. The lights in the pediatric wing were on. She could see movement behind the windows, nurses she'd trained, doing the work she wasn't allowed to do anymore. Connor Webb was upstairs, in ICU. Alive because of her, and she'd never get to see him walk again, never get to see him sign his first word to his father, never get confirmation that the seizures had stopped because the actual medical problem had been fixed. She'd stayed invisible for 18 years. Invisible in Baghdad. Invisible in Colorado Springs. Invisible because the Pentagon needed her silent, because her clearances required her to let her service record be erased, because some missions were classified so deep that even knowing they'd happened was a federal crime. She stood in the rain with a dying plant and a dead soldier's flag and wondered if staying invisible had ever been worth it. The termination letter arrived at 6 in the morning, slid under her apartment door while she slept. Laura found it on the linoleum, still damp from the rain that had hammered Colorado Springs all night. 3 pages. No hearing. No appeal. No signature from anyone willing to own the decision. The personnel file would note only that she exceeded scope of practice during a pediatric emergency, clinical language that translated to, "We will destroy you quietly, and you cannot defend yourself without exposing secrets the Pentagon buried so deep that speaking them aloud was a federal crime." She read it twice. Her hand stayed steady. Her jaw didn't clench. This was the part they never taught you in combat medicine, how to survive the kind of wound you couldn't treat, the kind that didn't bleed where anyone could see it. The bus stop on Tejan Street was sheltered by a corrugated awning that rattled in the wind like distant artillery. Laura stood there with a cardboard box balanced against her hip, the kind of box that held someone's entire professional identity. A cracked ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. A dying succulent she'd kept on her locker for 3 years, its leaves brown and curled like old parchment. A photograph in a silver frame, her Delta team from 2019, all of them alive then, grinning in front of an MH6 little bird at FOB Shank. 6 faces. Only 5 had come home. And folded at the bottom, the flag. Not a full-size flag, but a triangle of stars and stripes folded to a precise geometry, presenting the burial colors from Martinez's funeral 7 years ago. Sergeant Daniel Martinez, ID number 47621, KIA Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. Helicopter crash. No bodies recovered intact. She ran her thumb across the crease, the fabric worn soft from being touched 1,000 times on nights when the apartment walls felt like they were closing in. The rain came harder. She didn't move. Rain was just weather. Rain was nothing. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, then another, then another. Within an hour, reporters had found her, hospital board member must have leaked her name, or someone who saw the security footage of her saving the Webb boy. The story was too good. Military hero working as a nurse, fires a pediatrician for incompetence, gets destroyed for insubordination. They wanted her to confirm, to comment, to give them the narrative arc they could run with. She declined every call. By noon, she'd been home for 6 hours, sitting on her kitchen floor, surrounded by the contents of her apartment being sorted into 3 piles: keep, donate, trash. A 1-bedroom in Colorado Springs with furniture from IKEA and walls she'd never bothered to paint. 3 years of trying to be invisible. 3 years of wearing scrubs like armor and keeping her hands busy so she wouldn't think about what those hands had done. 14 soldiers stabilized under fire, 3 amputations performed without proper anesthesia, a baby delivered in the back of a dust-off helicopter while rounds came through the fuselage. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows. The kind of quiet that made you aware of every breath, every heartbeat. The kind of quiet that was probably how the whole world sounded when you were the only thing left alive. That was when Ethan burst through the door without knocking, breathless, his blonde hair dark with rain. 16 years old and already tall enough to fill the doorway, he had his father's height and his mother's composure, which meant he rarely moved fast, rarely raised his voice. Seeing him run was like watching a predator decide it was finished stalking. Mom. 1 word. He was holding a shadow box made from reclaimed wood, the kind you saw in military supply stores. His hands were shaking. I found this in the basement at your dad's place. We were looking for the old hockey equipment and I found, he held it out like it was made of nitroglycerine. Mom, they need to see these. You can't let him win. Inside the shadow box, arranged on navy felt backing, was her entire hidden life. A bronze star with Valor, the red and blue ribbon faded from decades of storage. A purple heart with its distinctive gold heart. A combat medical badge with crossed caduceus and sword. 3 decorations that represented decisions she'd made in the dark at 2 in the morning when the temperature was 127 degrees and someone's kid was drowning in their own blood. The medals caught the ceiling light. They looked like accusations. Ethan. I'm driving you back to the hospital. His voice was his father's voice now, the command structure underneath. Right now. With these. They need to know who you are. That's not how this works. Mom. He looked at her the way soldiers looked when they knew you were about to do something stupid. Dad knows. He's already there. Colonel Webb is already there. They're waiting. Laura wanted to tell him no. Wanted to tell him that some secrets existed for reasons, that staying buried was the price of staying alive, that invoking her military service meant destroying the clearances that kept her from being prosecuted for what she'd seen, what she knew, what she'd done on orders from people who didn't sign paperwork. But she looked at Ethan's face. At the shadow box he was holding like an offering. She stood up. She put on a dry jacket. She didn't argue. The drive back to Cedar Creek Medical took 18 minutes. The rain was still coming, the kind of rain that made the highway look like a river someone had forgotten to name. Ethan drove like he'd learned from someone who understood that control was just understanding exactly how much risk you could absorb. His hands on the wheel were steady. He'd inherited that too. Colonel Webb's been calling all morning, Ethan said as he drove. Apparently Connor had another seizure last night, but it was different. No tension pneumothorax, no dropping O2 Saturday. Just a regular seizure. Like whatever was broken, you fixed it. The 8-year-old deaf child was alive. Connor Webb was seizure-free. The hospital parking lot was different in daylight. The emergency entrance had a cluster of cars she didn't recognize, military vehicles, a sedan with government plates, a black SUV that screamed federal. Ethan pulled into a visitor spot and didn't move. I'm coming with you, he said. Stay in the car. Mom. I'm coming with you. She didn't argue. They walked through the rain together, Ethan holding the shadow box against his chest like armor. The pediatric administration wing was on the 2nd floor. When they stepped out of the elevator, the smell hit her, hospital antiseptic mixed with the coffee they served in the conference room, and underneath it, something like ozone from the electrical charge of 20 people in one room waiting for something to break. The conference room doors were open. Colonel Webb was standing at the head of the table, his presence occupying the space the way airborne operators occupied rooms, not by being loud, but by being immobile. Beside him stood a young Marine corporal in dress blues, one leg still healing, wheelchair folded beside him. The hospital board members flanked the table like uncertain clergy at a funeral. And there, in the corner, was a two-star general in service dress uniform, the kind of general who didn't travel to Colorado Springs unless something required his specific weight. General Harrison Webb. The general, not colonel. The distinction mattered. Captain Bennett. Not nurse. Not Ms. Bennett. Captain. Laura didn't correct him. The room had gone so quiet the fluorescent lights above them seemed to hum louder, as if the electricity itself was holding its breath. Ethan stepped forward with the shadow box. The young Marine, his name patch read Peterson, wheeled himself closer to Laura. He stared at her face like he was confirming something from a photograph he'd memorized in a field hospital somewhere south of Kandahar. Then he pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "I'm sorry, but I have to read this." His voice was steady the way young soldiers' voices got when they were reciting something they'd already rehearsed 1,000 times. Captain Laura Bennett, for extraordinary heroism under fire in Baghdad, single-handedly stabilizing 14 casualties while maintaining security protocols under sustained enemy contact when her medical convoy was ambushed in the Jolan district on, he paused, looking at the date. March 17, 2009. Bronze Star with Valor. The general stepped forward and didn't salute Laura. He saluted the shadow box. He saluted the decorations like they were the physical body of something sacred he was honoring. That was when Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the room like something breaking. "This is absurd." His voice was shaking, not the careful tone he used in grand rounds, but something raw underneath. "She's been investigated, I have documentation, I have personnel records, this is political correctness gone absolutely mad and you're all." The hospital IT director, a woman named Sarah Chen with silver streaked through her black hair and the calm of someone who'd worked in military-grade security systems, stepped forward with a tablet. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The conference room screen flickered to life. Timestamp, 23:22, 3 hours after Laura's termination letter had been printed. The security footage showed Dr. Pierce in the hospital's administrative office after hours, the fluorescent lights reflecting off his face like accusation. He was at a desktop terminal. Checking the hallway. Closing the door. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this sequence. The upload bar visible on his monitor, 10%. 40%. 60%. 80%. 100%. File deletion. Cancelled. File deletion. Cancelled. Each attempt logged, timestamped, preserved. 18 minutes of him trying to erase the security footage of Connor Webb's needle decompression. 18 minutes of calculated sabotage. 18 minutes of him destroying evidence. Then a second video cut in. The duty roster. March dates. Her shifts. He was changing them retroactively, making it appear that Laura had been working assignments Pierce claimed she'd violated, building a paper trail that would turn her life-saving procedure into insubordination. Pierce's face in the video was focused. Methodical. Not frantic. Not desperate. This was a man executing a plan. This was competence applied to destruction. The screen went black. Dr. Pierce, the hospital board president, said, her voice like someone speaking over a patient's code. "Did you alter medical records and duty roster assignments?" It was a clerical correction, the system had errors and I was simply. Security camera footage shows you attempting to delete files, then deliberately modifying historical records. The board president's hands were flat on the table. Yes or no? She performed procedures outside her scope of practice. She's a nurse who thought she was a. The general's voice cut through like a blade. She's a captain. With more combat medical experience than your entire department combined. He gestured to the shadow box. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart, twice over. Combat Medical Badge. She saved 14 soldiers bleeding out in the Jolin district while your pediatric residency was teaching you differential diagnosis from textbooks. Colonel Webb stepped between them. My son was dying. You wrote off his condition as behavioral. You blocked the one person in this hospital who understood what was wrong. Then you destroyed her career for saving his life. She's a legend, Peterson said quietly. His voice had the weight of field hospital whispers, the kind of testimony that traveled through forward operating bases across 3 theaters. We call her Valkyrie. We tell stories about her in every combat support hospital from Baghdad to Kandahar. And you fired her for doing exactly what she's always done, saving lives everyone else gave up on. The hospital legal counsel was writing notes so fast her pen kept stuttering against the paper. Dr. Pierce, I need you to confirm whether you accessed the hospital security system and whether you attempted to delete or modify security footage. Pierce's face was flushing now, the color rising from his collar to his temples. His composure was cracking like old paint. This is political correctness gone mad. You're going to destroy a pediatrician with 20 years of practice over some elaborate military story, Anna. The IT director tapped her tablet. The conference room screen flickered again. The break room. The vending machine. The footage was 3 weeks old. She could see Laura's face as Dr. Pierce leaned against the wall beside her, as 2 residents stood nearby pretending they weren't listening, as his voice came through the speakers clear enough to hear every word. Maybe she should stick to bedpans instead of playing doctor. Then his threat, 1 more insubordination and security will be escorting you out of here permanently. The screen went black. The board president stood up. When she moved, the entire room seemed to shift. Dr. Pierce, you're suspended effective immediately pending investigation by the State Medical Board for falsifying records, witness tampering, and destruction of evidence. Security will escort you from the building. Pierce looked around the room. The residents wouldn't meet his eyes. The attending physicians were stone-faced. The nurses in the back were whispering, among them, Nurse Chen, whose face had been erased from the duty roster for 3 weeks because she was the only witness to what really happened that night. She's a nobody, Pierce said, his voice hitting a frequency that wasn't words anymore. It was the sound of someone being unmade. A nurse who couldn't cut it in the real world. You're destroying my entire career for. Colonel Webb moved. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. His presence occupied the space between Pierce and everyone else like a door closing. She's the reason my son is alive. You're the reason he almost died. Security entered from the side door. 2 officers. Professional. Quiet. The kind of security that didn't announce itself. They didn't touch Dr. Pierce. They just stood there, present as gravity, until he understood that he was leaving. He left. The room exhaled. 6 months later, Cedar Creek Medical's pediatric emergency department operated under new management. Laura Bennett's name was on the office door, but it didn't say nurse anymore. It said Dr. Bennett, physician assistant and combat trauma liaison, a position the hospital had created specifically for her, and the board had fast-tracked her PA certification through an accelerated program that normally took years. Her office was small, with a window that looked out onto the Cheyenne Mountains. The folded flag from Martinez's funeral sat on her desk beside the photograph of her Delta team. No longer hidden. No longer a secret kept in dark places. Connor Webb, the 8-year-old boy whose mysterious seizures had been written off as behavioral, sat across from her teaching basic ASL. He was seizure-free now, 6 months post-surgery for the congenital cardiac defect that Dr. Pierce had dismissed entirely. Turns out a failing heart can look like a psychological problem if you're not trained in what to listen for. Laura's hands had learned 300 signs in 6 months, practiced every lunch break, carved out space in her day for a child who didn't speak in a world that demanded sound. Colonel Webb stopped by weekly, brought coffee, told her she'd saved more than his son's life. The young Marine Corporal, Peterson, was walking now with a carbon fiber prosthetic and a cane. He'd become the military wing's patient advocate, and he'd started a wall of honor featuring combat medics who'd transitioned to civilian healthcare. Laura's photo was first, her Valkyrie call sign stenciled underneath in military Gothic lettering, the kind that looked carved rather than painted. Nurse Chen had requested a permanent transfer to pediatrics. Nurse Practica, who'd been reassigned by Pierce's roster manipulation, had come back to Laura's team. The hospital created new protocols based on Laura's recommendations, systems for recognizing combat-adjacent trauma patterns in military families, ways to listen to quiet voices before they became emergencies. Dr. Morris, the attending who'd frozen when Connor's O2 saturation began dropping, found his spine. He testified against Pierce and now ran grand rounds every Monday, opening with the same words, "Listen to your nurses. Especially the quiet ones." The state medical board stripped Dr. Pierce of his medical license pending investigation for falsified records and patient endangerment. Last anyone heard, he was driving a medical supply van for a rural clinic 4 hours away. Delivering bedpans and blood pressure cuffs through New Mexico deserts, the kind of work he'd told Laura to stick to. Irony was just karma with better timing. Laura's son Ethan kept the shadow box in his dorm room at the Air Force Academy, the one he'd earned his appointment to after he'd seen his mother finally stop running from who she was. He told everyone he met that his mom was a legend, that she'd saved lives nobody else could see were worth saving, that she'd kept her classified service record buried for 7 years because the Pentagon needed her silence more than she needed vindication. The general from Peterson Space Force Base sent quarterly requests for Laura to consult on combat casualty training protocols. She accepted every one. On her office wall, between her credentials and a crayon drawing Connor had made of her as a superhero in scrubs with a cape, hung a small plaque. Martinez's family had sent it after they learned she was no longer hiding what he'd meant to her. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. She read it every morning before rounds. Touched the folded flag. Went to work, no longer invisible, no longer silent, finally home in her own skin. If you've made it this far, you know something about what it means to be underestimated. To be overlooked because you chose to be quiet. To hold secrets that could destroy you but you carried them anyway because the weight of other people's lives mattered more than your own visibility. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones who saved the world and nobody noticed until it was almost too late. Like this video, comment what you would have done in Laura's position, and hit that notification bell because these stories matter. The ones who've seen the worst often have more to teach us than anyone.